When the first Neanderthal skull was uncovered in 1856 in Germany's Neander Valley, the bones did not merely rest in soil, they became instruments of ideology. Early anatomists, trained in a cultural atmosphere obsessed with progress and linear ascent, looked at the thick brow ridges and low, elongated cranium and saw not variation, but inferiority. One of the most influential figures, the French anatomist Marcellin Boule, reconstructed the La Chapelle-aux-Saints skeleton in the early 20th century as a hunched, dim-witted brute. He exaggerated the curvature of the spine and the thrust of the jaw, portraying Neanderthals as ape-like remnants. These visual choices mattered. They filtered into textbooks, popular magazines, even political rhetoric. For more than a century, the public image of the Neanderthal was shaped less by bone than by bias. The caricature of the stupid caveman fit neatly into the Victorian worldview. It reinforced a comforting hierarchy. Modern Europeans at the pinnacle, earlier hominins consigned to the shadows. The club-wielding, slack-jawed Neanderthal became an emblem of arrested development, a fossil cautionary tale. Few questioned whether these depictions were grounded in selective interpretation. Scientific objectivity was entangled with cultural prejudice, and Neanderthals were cast in roles they never auditioned for. Even museum dioramas, with shaggy figures dragging carcasses across bleak landscapes, operated as subconscious propaganda. They marked Neanderthals as failed experiments, placeholders on the road to us. But bone resists narrative. As excavations spread from Germany to France, Croatia, the Middle East, and Siberia, inconsistencies in the stereotype accumulated. The skeletons did not always match Boule's reconstruction. Evidence of arthritis in the La Chapelle specimen, once misread as primitive curvature, suggested that what had been painted as brutish deformity was actually the result of disease in an elderly individual. Other remains revealed robust but well-proportioned postures, hands with dexterity, and skulls with cranial capacities rivaling or exceeding our own. The brute began to look less like a monster and more like a distorted reflection. Even as the evidence shifted, the myth proved resilient. Cultural inertia kept the image alive well into the 20th century. Advertisements mocked Neanderthals as shorthand for stupidity. Children's cartoons depicted them as clumsy, grunting cavemen. The figure was psychologically useful. It allowed modern humans to displace fears of regression onto an afituin, other Seethider-keen, Seethider species. The Neanderthal was not just a fossil. It was a projection of anxiety about the fragility of intelligence. In the subconscious of industrial society, where progress felt precarious, the image of the failed Neanderthal reinforced the illusion of inevitability. We survived because we were smarter. Yet science rarely tolerates comforting illusions for long. Radiocarbon dating, first applied to Neanderthal sites in the mid-20th century, collapsed timelines and forced archaeologists to confront the uncomfortable overlap between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. These were not remote ancestors, but contemporaries who shared landscapes, prey, and perhaps even hearths. New excavations revealed burial practices, pigment use, and complex tools. Each discovery gnawed at the stereotype, but what unsettled researchers most was not the evidence itself, but what it implied. The Neanderthal was not an evolutionary failure, it was an evolutionary alternative. The psychological dissonance this created was profound. If Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, if they made art, if they buried their dead, then intelligence itself was not a singular path, but a branching phenomenon. This realization undermined the comfortable idea of human uniqueness. It suggested that cognition, creativity, and even symbolic thought were not privileges bestowed solely upon Homo sapiens, but capacities that emerged in parallel minds. The old myth of stupidity began to crack, but what replaced it was less reassuring. It raised the specter of intelligence as fragile, contingent, and capable of vanishing. Historians of science, such as Stephen Jay Gould, later dissected these biases, showing how the misrepresentation of Neanderthals revealed more about human arrogance than about paleoanthropology. Bias operated not only in reconstructions, but in the framing of questions themselves. For decades, researchers asked, why did Neanderthals fail? Rather than, what strengths did they possess? This framing infected interpretation, making every tool appear clumsy, every adaptation temporary, every cultural sign ambiguous. The lens was skewed, and what was filtered through it emerged distorted. As neuroscience advanced, new metaphors took hold. Brain imaging in the late 20th century revealed the complexity of our own cognition: distributed networks, parallel processing, regions specialized for memory, emotion, language. Applied retrospectively, these insights forced anthropologists to reconsider the Neanderthal cranium not as an empty vessel, but as a differently configured organ of thought. The elongated occipital regions hinted at heightened visuospatial processing. The enlarged areas for motor control suggested fine manipulation and embodied intelligence. Each anatomical detail whispered of a mind not weaker, but differently tuned. The deeper the reanalysis, the more unstable the myth became. No longer could the Neanderthal be dismissed as a dull shadow. Instead, researchers confronted a paradox: a species both like us and unlike us, bearing traces of cognition that resisted easy categorization. This ambiguity unsettled the boundaries between species, forcing a reckoning with our own fragility. For if Neanderthals could be misread for so long, how certain could we be of the categories we now draw? The stereotype of stupidity had protected us from these questions, but once stripped away, the bones demanded something more difficult: acknowledgement of a kindred intelligence, one that flourished for hundreds of thousands of years and left marks not only on stone, but perhaps on our very genomes. And yet, the dismantling of myth was not a triumphal unveiling. It was a slow erosion, a psychological unmooring that left researchers grappling with uncomfortable possibilities that had only begun to surface. The skulls unearthed from Neanderthal sites reveal a striking paradox. Their cranial capacity averaged around 1,450 cubic centimeters, often larger than that of modern Homo sapiens. Endocasts, the impressions left inside fossilized skulls, provide clues about this configuration. Compared with modern humans, Neanderthals show a pronounced expansion of the occipital region, the part of the brain associated with visual processing. In Ice Age environments, where shifting light, dense forests, and snowbound plains tested perception, enhanced visuospatial acuity may have been critical. Larger occipital lobes suggest not just sharper vision, but greater ability to interpret patterns in complex landscapes, to track prey across subtle environmental cues, and to orient in conditions where survival hinged on attention to detail. At the same time, their parietal regions, particularly the superior parietal lobule, appear somewhat reduced relative to ours. This area in Homo sapiens is linked to symbolic integration, abstract reasoning, and the mental manipulation of objects. It has been argued that the balance in Neanderthals tilted toward embodied interaction with the environment rather than abstract projection. Yet such distinctions are treacherous. Cognitive science has shown that visuospatial intelligence and abstract thought are not isolated domains, but overlapping processes. In fact, the human ability to reason mathematically or to imagine hypothetical scenarios often recruits visuospatial networks. The Neanderthal configuration may represent a different blend of emphasis rather than a deficit. Motor cortex regions, inferred from skull morphology, also appear more developed in Neanderthals, consistent with their powerful physiques and reliance on tool use requiring precision. Fine motor control underpins not only the shaping of stone tools, but also the crafting of adhesives, ornaments, and perhaps even textiles. Modern neuroscience underscores how motor regions are not merely mechanical controllers, but integrators of perception and memory. The act of striking stone with predictable force requires predictive coding, an anticipatory neural mechanism where the brain simulates outcomes before they occur. Every blow to flint was, in this sense, a rehearsal of causality, embedding physical law into neural circuits. Frontal regions, the seat of planning and social cognition, invite the most speculation. Neanderthals had relatively broad frontal lobes, though shaped differently from ours. Some paleoneurologists suggest this reflects variation in executive functioning, perhaps a stronger emphasis on working memory and immediate planning, perhaps less on long-range symbolic synthesis. But caution is warranted. Comparative studies in primates reveal that brain shape does not map neatly onto a ladder of intelligence. Instead, it reflects ecological adaptations. The Neanderthal mind may have been optimized for cohesion within small groups, rapid adaptation to fluctuating climates, and meticulous interaction with material environments. Genetics adds another layer. Analysis of Neanderthal genomes revealed the presence of the FOXP2 gene, long associated with language capacity in humans. FOXP2 mutations in modern families lead to difficulties in syntax, motor sequencing, and speech articulation. That Neanderthals carried the same functional variant suggests that their neural architecture supported at least some form of complex communication. Brain shape alone does not determine linguistic possibility. Genetic scaffolding indicates the potential for structured symbolic systems. The implication is that their frontal temporal circuits, though differently configured, may have supported forms of language, perhaps not identical to ours, but sufficient for transmitting knowledge, coordinating hunts, and sustaining ritual practices. The limbic system, though invisible in fossils, must also be considered. Enlarged eye sockets in Neanderthals imply reliance on strong visual input, which some researchers link to greater metabolic demand from visual cortices. This could, in theory, leave proportionally less neural allocation for higher-order social networks. Robin Dunbar's social brain hypothesis argues that the size of neocortical regions predicts group size. By this reasoning, Neanderthals may have formed smaller, tighter groups than Homo sapiens. Yet the trade-off may have been depth of interaction rather than breadth. A smaller social radius does not equate to reduced complexity. It may foster more intense emotional bonds, deeper cooperation, and more sophisticated empathy within the group unit. Neuroscience of embodied cognition suggests another angle. A brain with heightened motor and visuospatial integration could blur the boundary between perception and action more fluidly than in our own. Modern experiments on athletes and craftsmen demonstrate how neural circuits tuned for skilled movement can facilitate altered states of flow, where self-conscious thought dissolves into seamless performance. If Neanderthals inhabited such states more frequently, their intelligence may have felt less like abstract rumination and more like direct attunement with the world. This form of cognition, precise, immediate, immersive, would not leave behind written records, but it would leave archaeological traces in the meticulous shaping of tools and the survival of communities in hostile landscapes. Contemporary neuroscience also complicates the notion of deficit by emphasizing distributed networks rather than isolated regions. Intelligence emerges from connectivity, white matter tracts binding frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital zones into integrated circuits. If Neanderthal brains wired their networks differently, the outcome may have been cognitive styles alien to us, yet equally adaptive. Their thought world might have prioritized spatial memory over narrative, procedural mastery over abstraction, sensory richness over conceptual generalization. Such differences would be invisible to bones, but profound in lived experience. Even the metabolic cost of large brains raises unsettling questions. Neural tissue is energetically expensive, demanding about 20% of resting human metabolism. For Neanderthals, living in glacial Europe, the burden of fueling such brains would have been extreme. Survival required not only hunting and gathering, but sustaining a constant flow of calories to power cognition. Every mammoth brought down, every root dug from frozen soil, carried the hidden purpose of keeping neural fire alive. Intelligence was not an ornament, but a metabolic gamble, a wager with high stakes in unforgiving climates. As the fossil evidence, genetic data, and neuroscientific parallels accumulate, the silhouette of the Neanderthal mind sharpens, not into familiarity, but into strangeness. It suggests an intelligence that shared foundations with our own, yet unfolded along divergent pathways, producing capacities not directly comparable, but deeply consequential. The closer we look, the more that image slips from comforting categories, leaving us with a portrait of cognition balanced on thresholds we are only beginning to discern. Stone flakes, once dismissed as primitive debris, have become testimonies to deliberate intention. The Mousterian toolkit associated with Neanderthals is not the crude improvisation it was once imagined to be, but the outcome of complex cognitive routines. At its core lies the Levallois technique, a method in which stone cores were carefully prepared in advance to yield flakes of predictable shape and size. This strategy requires mental rehearsal, the capacity to envision a sequence of strikes, and the foresight to anticipate a final form that does not yet exist. Cognitive archaeologists describe it as a manifestation of hierarchical planning, akin to a mental algorithm, steps ordered, rehearsed, and executed with precision. Scrapers, points, and knives shaped through this technique were not merely tools, but extensions of thought. Wear analysis shows that scrapers were employed in processing hides, shaving fibers, and preparing animal skins for shelter or clothing. The edges were maintained, resharpened, and sometimes recycled into new forms. Such efficiency betrays a knowledge economy. Resources were not wasted, but circulated within systems of use and reuse. Behind each tool lies not just skill, but a concept of durability, of continuity between present labor and future necessity. Even more telling are the composite tools, where stone points were hafted onto wooden shafts using adhesives made of birch, pitch, or resin mixed with ochre. The creation of such adhesives required pyrotechnology and chemical awareness. To extract birch tar, bark had to be heated in oxygen-deprived conditions, a controlled process that mirrors modern techniques of distillation. Residues on artifacts confirm this mastery. It demonstrates not only knowledge of materials, but also the capacity to coordinate multiple steps across time. Collecting bark, preparing a chamber or pit, regulating heat, and binding stone to wood. Modern experiments show that small deviations in temperature or oxygen supply spoil the product, meaning the Neanderthal process relied on keen observation, memory, and adjustment. Archaeological findings from sites such as Königsauer in Germany and Campitello in Italy provide direct evidence of these adhesives, their chemical fingerprints surviving across tens of millennia. These traces anchor speculation in material fact. What emerges is a picture of technological sophistication that blurs the distinction between biology and chemistry. Fire was not only warmth and protection, it was a laboratory in which substances were transformed into new states of utility. Each adhesive point carries within it a silent record of procedural intelligence, the kind that bridges raw perception with abstract cause and effect. Regional variation in Mousterian assemblages complicates any assumption of homogeneity. In France, the Quina variant emphasizes thick scrapers suited for heavy-duty work, while in Central Europe, denticulated tools with saw-like edges suggest specialized processing. In the Levant, Neanderthal assemblages sometimes overlap with early Homo sapiens, displaying convergent innovations. Such diversity implies not random chance, but cultural traditions, knowledge transmitted, adapted, and localized. This form of technological identity indicates more than individual skill. It signals group memory and cultural inheritance. Experimental archaeology highlights the cognitive load embedded in these practices. Modern flint knappers trained to replicate Levallois methods report that it requires months of rehearsal to internalize the sequence. The brain must manage feedback loops between perception and motor control, recalibrating with each strike. Neuroimaging of modern humans practicing similar tasks shows activation across motor cortex, parietal lobes, and prefrontal regions, an integration of spatial reasoning, fine control, and executive planning. When mapped onto Neanderthal endocasts, the correspondence suggests that their neural structures supported comparable integration. Each flake detached was the material residue of a complex orchestration of thought. The social dimension of tool production cannot be overlooked. Napping leaves behind auditory and visual cues, which likely facilitated learning by observation. The rhythmic percussion of hammer on core is not unlike a metronome, its sound reinforcing sequences and transmitting. Tacit knowledge, anthropologists studying traditional crafts today note that novices often learn through immersion in rhythm and repetition rather than explicit verbal instruction. Neanderthals, equipped with motor intelligence and communication systems, may have fostered apprenticeships in which rhythm became pedagogy. The cave floor, littered with flakes, was also a classroom. Yet these implements were not only practical instruments, but artifacts with aesthetic implications. Microscopic examination of some tools reveals that they were retouched beyond functional necessity, edges sharpened and shapes refined even after usability was assured. Such behavior hints at a cognitive desire for symmetry, order, or perhaps even beauty. In psychology, the preference for symmetry is linked to perceptual fluency and neural efficiency. To craft a tool more elegant than required may have engaged motivational systems beyond survival. Here lies the faint suggestion of an aesthetic impulse, an early negotiation between utility and form. The durability of these technologies across vast stretches of time also invites reflection. For more than 200,000 years, Mousterian strategies persisted with only regional modifications. To modern eyes, this stability might seem like stagnation, but from another perspective, it reveals a deep attunement. The system worked, refined to fit environmental constraints, reliable across generations. Neuroscientists who study procedural memory know that repetition ingrains resilience. Behaviors repeated without collapse suggest cultures of mastery, where fidelity of transmission was itself a survival mechanism. The Neanderthal toolkit was less an innovation race and more a stable architecture, like a well-tuned instrument that does not need redesign to perform. Recent discoveries extend the horizon of their technological repertoire even further. Wooden spears from Schöningen in Germany, dated to 300,000 years ago, predate Homo sapiens and suggest thrusting weapons engineered with balance and aerodynamic foresight. One spear, carefully shaped from spruce, tapers toward the point like a modern javelin, distributing weight for effective throwing. This reveals that Neanderthals inherited or independently developed woodworking strategies requiring acute awareness of material properties. To carve wood with such precision implies not only strength, but a refined sense of geometry embedded in practice. Every flake, scraper, and spear, when examined with scientific rigor, discloses more than mechanical skill. It illuminates neural architectures capable of foresight, precision, and cultural continuity. These tools are artifacts of cognition externalized, solidified into matter, preserving traces of a mind trained to shape the environment through recursive acts of planning. Yet the archaeological record is fragmentary, leaving questions suspended, in silence. How far did these cognitive capacities extend beyond stone and wood? What other domains of life absorbed the same intelligence, structured by rhythm, chemistry, and embodied skill, but less easily fossilized? The effectiveness of a spear or scraper lies not only in its design, but in the coordinated behavior that gave it purpose. Archaeological traces of Neanderthal subsistence show a level of tactical organization that contradicts the image of opportunistic scavengers. The faunal remains preserved in sites across Europe and the Levant reveal patterns of hunting that required foresight, spatial intelligence, and social cohesion. Cut marks on mammoth bones from La Côte de Saint-Brelade on Jersey suggest that entire herds were driven toward natural traps, where cliffs or steep ravines transformed into killing grounds. Such strategies demanded more than brute force. They required collective anticipation of animal movement, division of roles within groups, and the ability to manipulate landscape features as extensions of cognition. Cognitive scientists would describe this as distributed problem-solving, intelligence, externalized across individuals and terrain, stitched together into a system of coordinated action. Isotopic analysis of Neanderthal collagen provides further evidence of their role as apex predators. Nitrogen isotope ratios extracted from bones at sites like Vindija Cave in Croatia and Saint-Césaire in France place their trophic level alongside that of wolves and big cats, but with a greater reliance on large herbivores such as bison, horse, and reindeer. This profile does not fit a pattern of passive scavenging, but rather of consistent access to prime cuts of meat. The capacity to secure such resources at scale implies mastery of pursuit and capture, activities that entailed not only muscular power but strategic cooperation. The planning depth involved becomes clearer when considering prey behavior. Herd animals possess strong flight responses, capable of dispersing rapidly if threatened without structure. To trap them requires predictive modeling of movement, anticipating how groups will respond to noise, pressure, or terrain barriers. Experimental reconstructions by anthropologists demonstrate that to drive even a small group of deer into confined spaces, hunters must coordinate timing, noise signals, and spatial positioning with remarkable accuracy. The archaeological record of mass kill sites suggests that Neanderthals engaged in such collective choreography repeatedly across different environments, where on spear points further suggests close-range hunting. Unlike later Homo sapiens, who developed lighter projectiles and eventually bows, Neanderthals relied heavily on thrusting spears. This meant approaching prey at dangerous proximity, a task that demanded courage, coordination, and trust in one's companions. The neurological implications are significant. Close-quarter hunting activates systems of arousal, fear regulation, and motor precision, requiring not just physical readiness, but the ability to suppress hesitation in the moment of engagement. Social psychology studies of modern hunters and soldiers alike show that success in high-risk group endeavors depends on mutual reliance and the transmission of calm under stress. Neanderthals appear to have cultivated similar mechanisms, embedded within their survival routines. Ethnographic analogies can shed further light. Among modern hunter-gatherers, successful large-game hunting is rarely a solitary act. It involves shared ritual, communication, and post-hunt distribution. If Neanderthals engaged in analogous practices, their cognitive landscape would have been shaped not only by pursuit, but by anticipation of collective reward and reinforcement of group bonds. Meat from large kills could be preserved or shared, creating interdependencies that strengthened social fabric. The predictability of such cooperation may have been as vital as the hunt itself. Recent use-wear and residue studies complicate the picture even further. At sites such as Abri du Maras in France, residues of twisted plant fibers have been discovered, suggesting that Neanderthals manufactured cords or ropes. If these fibers were indeed used in hunting contexts as snares, bindings, or components of composite weapons, then the sophistication of their strategies expands beyond direct confrontation to include passive capture methods. Rope technology represents abstraction, envisioning the manipulation of animal movement through tension and restraint, concepts that align closely with cognitive domains of physics and mechanical reasoning. The seasonal dimension of hunting also reveals forward planning. Migratory patterns of reindeer and horses were not random but cyclical. Evidence of repeated occupation of the same hunting sites at different times of year suggests that Neanderthals tracked these cycles and returned strategically to intercept herds. Such scheduling implies calendrical awareness, not in the formalized sense of written record, but as embodied memory encoded in landscape and tradition. To maintain this knowledge across generations required transmission, an oral or gestural culture robust enough to preserve timing cues that could mean the difference between abundance and hunger. Even the risks of hunting bear cognitive weight. Fossilized skeletons show evidence of injuries consistent with encounters with large animals, rib fractures, skull trauma, and damaged limbs. Some of these individuals lived long enough for bones to heal, indicating group care, but the frequency of such injuries attests to repeated engagement in dangerous pursuits. To continue such practices despite personal risk suggests psychological frameworks capable of managing fear, reinforcing collective responsibility, and valuing group survival over individual safety. Neurobiological studies of risk-taking behavior link such resilience to dopamine-driven reward circuits, systems that reinforce repeated exposure to danger when outcomes are beneficial. Hunting large animals may have been as much an addictive pursuit as a nutritional one, binding Neanderthals to cycles of risk and reward encoded deep in their neural architecture. When examined closely, the archaeological signatures of Neanderthal hunting expose a web of cognition interlaced with environment, physiology, and social interdependence. Each site represents not an isolated act of predation, but a choreography of perception, communication, and planning carried out under conditions of constant uncertainty. Yet, questions linger. Did their tactical intelligence extend beyond subsistence into other domains of communal life? Were the same neural circuits that guided prey into traps also employed in shaping fire, pigments, or rituals that have left more ambiguous traces? The evidence points toward capacities we can measure only indirectly, capacities that seem to hover at the threshold of what we are willing to recognize as fully human. The power of fire transformed the risks of the hunt into nourishment, reshaping both physiology and culture. Hearths uncovered in Neanderthal sites, rings of charcoal, reddened sediments, and concentrations of burnt bone testify to controlled use of flame that was neither sporadic nor incidental. Caves such as Kibara in Israel, Pech de la Zay in France, and Abric Romani in Spain contain layered sequences of ash, indicating repeated occupation and maintenance of fire over extended periods. This pattern is not the residue of opportunism, but the material imprint of deliberate control, a technology requiring vigilance, planning, and knowledge of combustible materials. Cooking altered the nutritional landscape of Ice Age Europe. Raw. Meat from large herbivores is rich in protein but resistant to digestion. Heat denatures muscle fibers, breaks down connective tissue, and releases caloric value otherwise locked away. Plant foods, often fibrous or toxic in raw form, become palatable when roasted or boiled. Residues preserved in dental calculus from El Cedron in Spain reveal starch grains from legumes and grasses, some showing signs of heat modification. Such microscopic evidence confirms that Neanderthals expanded their dietary range through cooking, extracting energy with greater efficiency from both animal and plant resources. The act of tending a fire also required attention beyond immediate survival. To maintain embers overnight, to rekindle flames with gathered tinder, to transport glowing coals across a landscape, all these demanded sustained foresight. Cognitive science describes such behavior as temporal extension, the ability to project present actions into future states. Fire, once lit, imposes responsibility. It must be fed, guarded against wind and rain, shielded from overgrowth of fuel that would smother it. Each hearth was a node of vigilance, where human presence and natural force were bound in ongoing negotiation. Archaeological analysis of hearth placement inside caves reveals additional layers of intelligence. In many sites, fire is positioned, not randomly, but with spatial logic, central to living areas, near working surfaces, yet distant enough from walls to avoid smoke accumulation. Some hearths occur in clusters, suggesting partitioned activity zones where cooking, tool production, and social interaction coexisted. Experimental studies on smoke dispersion confirm that such placement minimizes respiratory irritation and maximizes light. These choices imply practical knowledge of airflow, acquired through experience and retained through cultural memory. The neurological consequences of cooking extend beyond digestion. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham's cooking hypothesis argues that the mastery of fire fueled the evolutionary expansion of human brains by increasing caloric intake relative to effort. For Neanderthals, whose brains were already metabolically demanding, cooked food may have been indispensable. Caloric density from roasted meat and softened tubers provided the energy to sustain large neural networks and muscular physiques in glacial climates where scarcity threatened constantly. Without fire, their ecological niche would have been unsustainable. But fire's significance was not confined to biology. Its sensory presence, flickering light, rhythmic crackling, shifting warmth, created an environment conducive to altered states of consciousness. Neuropsychological studies of flicker frequencies demonstrate that rhythmic light at certain intervals can induce trance-like brainwave patterns, enhancing suggestibility and relaxation. Around hearths, shadows danced on cave walls, extending perception into illusory motion. In such contexts, communication could deepen, memory could be reinforced, and social bonds could be ritualized. Fire was both a tool and a stage, transforming night into a theater of cognition. Evidence of repeated hearth construction across generations also signals symbolic resonance. Ash deposits layered in sequence indicate not merely survival, but continuity, an inheritance of place and memory. Modern hunter-gatherer ethnographies reveal that hearths often anchor social identity, serving as loci of storytelling, ritual, and decision-making. While direct evidence of Neanderthal ritual at hearths remains elusive, the persistence of fire-centered spaces implies that meaning accumulated alongside function. To gather repeatedly around flame is to inscribe territory with familiarity, to bind community through shared vigilance. The chemistry of fire use further complicates the narrative. Charred remains of bitumen and resins suggest that Neanderthals experimented with substances beyond food. At sites such as el Tlel in Syria, bitumen traces on stone tools hint at adhesive production involving deliberate heating. Such processes required temperature control more delicate than cooking, pointing toward an empirical knowledge of transformation. Matter reconfigured under thermal stress. In cognitive terms, this represents causal reasoning, the recognition that invisible forces, when manipulated, yield predictable outcomes. Ash itself became a material resource. Some sites preserve evidence of ash layers deliberately spread, possibly to insulate sleeping areas or deter insects. In modern ethnographic contexts, ash serves as both cleanser and preservative, inhibiting bacterial growth. If Neanderthals applied similar practices, their cognition extended beyond immediate fire to the byproducts of combustion. This implies a capacity for secondary exploitation, an ability to see not only the flame, but its residue as useful in shaping living conditions. What remains most elusive is the cultural dimension of shared fire. Unlike solitary acts of tool-making, hearths demanded collective participation. The tending of flames, the sharing of cooked food, the gathering within circles of light, all converged on the creation of communal identity. Neurobiological research on synchrony shows that shared experiences of rhythm and warmth enhance oxytocin release, fostering trust and cohesion. Around a hearth, neural states may have converged, aligning individuals into a cooperative unit. Fire thus operated as both material technology and social catalyst. Yet the archaeological record captures only fragments of this dynamic. Ash and charcoal tell us where flames once burned, but not the words exchanged in their glow, nor the gestures that bound groups in silence. The hearths of Neanderthals remain mute, their symbolic charge inaccessible except through inference. Still, each blackened layer in sediment whispers of more than sustenance. It suggests cycles of attention, patterns of sociality, and experiments with transformation that extended cognition into domains we can scarcely reconstruct. And beneath these traces lies the deeper question of whether fire, once mastered, shaped not just survival strategies, but the very architecture of meaning itself, a possibility that the evidence continues to hold suspended without resolution. Pigments ground into powders, lines etched into stone, and shells perforated for stringing. These fragile remnants suggest that Neanderthals moved beyond subsistence into domains where material objects carried layered meanings. The evidence is subtle, often contested, yet cumulative enough to unsettle the notion of a mind preoccupied only with survival. Symbolism leaves fewer durable traces than tools or bones, but when it surfaces in the archaeological record, it speaks to cognitive. Architectures attuned not only to utility, but to abstraction, representation, and identity. One of the most striking discoveries emerged from caves in Spain, La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales, where uranium-thorium dating of calcite deposits confirmed that red pigment markings on walls predated the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe by more than 20,000 years. These images, simple geometric motifs such as lines, dots, and hand stencils, are among the oldest known cave paintings in the world. Their antiquity attributes them not to intrusive modern humans, but to Neanderthals themselves. Such markings are not the byproduct of accident. They are deliberate placements, created with awareness of visibility, contrast, and persistence across time. The application of pigment indicates control over materials far beyond culinary or practical contexts. Ochre must be sourced, crushed, and mixed with binders such as fat or water to produce usable paint. This process requires foresight and suggests that color was valued in itself, independent of survival. In psychology, color preference is often linked to symbolic association, red with vitality, black with danger or authority, white with purity or transition. While we cannot reconstruct Neanderthal semiotics, the very act of pigment production implies recognition of a dimension where color functioned as signifier, a medium for expressing meaning beyond object form. Personal adornments add to this picture. In sites such as Cueva de los Aviones and Cueva Anton in southeastern Spain, perforated marine shells stained with pigments have been uncovered, dating back nearly 115,000 years. These artifacts reveal a practice of body decoration or ornamentation, behaviors widely interpreted as signals of social identity. To string shells into necklaces or attach them to clothing transforms raw material into symbolic marker, indicating group affiliation, status, or even individual role. In cognitive anthropology, such practices are considered indicators of theory of mind, the recognition that others perceive and interpret visible signals, and that self-presentation can be manipulated to influence those perceptions. Engravings at Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar reinforce this trajectory. There, deeply incised cross-hatched patterns carved into bedrock resist utilitarian explanation. Their placement on a prominent rock surface, combined with the difficulty of execution, suggests intentionality directed toward visibility and permanence. Experimental replication demonstrates that producing such engravings requires repeated, deliberate strokes, far exceeding the effort of mere idle scratching. The geometry hints at abstract thought, an ability to impose form onto inert stone, thereby externalizing mental order into durable matter. Debates around these findings often hinge on the threshold of symbolism. Critics argue that simple marks or pigments could arise from functional behavior, stains from processing minerals, scratches from tool sharpening. Yet the contextual clustering of pigment use, ornaments, and engravings across different regions strengthens the case for symbolic cognition. In cognitive science, the interpretation of pattern depends less on isolated acts than on recurrence, across contexts. When practices reappear in distinct populations separated by distance and time, they signify cultural patterns, not coincidence. The role of firelight in caves may have further amplified these symbolic experiments. As flickering illumination cast shifting shadows across painted walls, static motifs could appear animated, imbued with agency. Neuropsychological studies of low-light environments reveal heightened suggestibility and altered perception under such conditions. It is plausible that pigment markings, when viewed in the glow of hearths, evoked sensations that bridged perception and imagination, embedding images into memory with emotional force. Symbolism, in this view, was not inert but performative, a dynamic interplay between light, pigment, and cognition. Body ornamentation carries another layer of significance, its function in group cohesion and recognition. In small bands navigating harsh Ice Age landscapes, signaling identity may have been vital in encounters with outsiders. Adornments could communicate kinship, mating availability, or cultural allegiance, reducing conflict through visible markers. Social psychology demonstrates how symbolic clothing and decoration serve as boundary maintenance in modern groups. Their prehistoric counterparts likely functioned similarly, embedding individuals into networks of trust and obligation. The neurological basis of such behaviors rests on associative learning and episodic memory. To invest objects with symbolic weight requires linking sensory input with abstract categories. This red mark signifies belonging. This carved cross recalls a shared tradition. Functional neuroimaging of modern humans engaged in symbolic drawing shows activation across parietal and prefrontal networks, regions associated with spatial reasoning, working memory, and planning. Neanderthal endocasts suggest these regions were present and robust, making symbolic cognition not only possible but neurologically plausible. Yet ambiguity lingers. The symbolic record of Neanderthals is sparse compared to the later efflorescence of Homo sapiens art in places like Chauvet or Lascaux. Some interpret this as evidence of limitation. Others argue it reflects preservation bias, chance survival of pigments and ornaments in particular caves, while countless others vanished. Archaeology is hostage to survival, and absence in the record need not equal absence in practice. The scattered. Artifacts that endure may be mere fragments of a symbolic world once richer than the sediments now suggest. Still, the persistence of debate is itself telling. It points to our unease at granting Neanderthals full access to symbolic thought, as though acknowledging their artistry erodes a boundary guarding our uniqueness. Yet the pigments and engravings resist dismissal, compelling recognition of a cognitive horizon that extends beyond subsistence. Each shell and stroke in stone hints at worlds of meaning now irretrievable, whispers of identities constructed not only through flesh and survival, but through signs and representations. What remains unsettled is whether these symbolic gestures were marginal embellishments or central to their way of life, a question that lingers unresolved in the silence of caves and the faint traces of pigment still clinging to stone. Excavations in caves once inhabited by Neanderthals reveal more than hearths and tools. In certain places, the earth itself carries evidence of deliberate interment. Few discoveries have generated more debate than the graves of Shanidar Cave. In Iraqi Kurdistan, where several Neanderthal individuals were found arranged in shallow pits. Pollen grains clustered around one skeleton were initially interpreted as remnants of flowers placed deliberately with the body. Though later critics suggested rodent activity might explain the pollen distribution, the very persistence of the debate underscores the significance of what such an act would mean. Recognition of death not merely as physical cessation, but as an event warranting symbolic response. Burial, even in its simplest form, requires abstraction. To place a body in the ground is to acknowledge both its finality as living organism and its continuity as social presence. It transforms decay from chaotic exposure into structured ritual, protecting the corpse from scavengers while inscribing memory into place. In Shanidar and elsewhere, La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, Teshiktash in Uzbekistan, skeletal remains arranged within pits suggest purposeful covering with sediment. Such acts cannot be reduced to accident. They represent decisions made, in the presence of mortality, choices that echo far beyond the moment of interment. The neurological implications are considerable. Awareness of death engages prefrontal regions linked to future-oriented thinking and symbolic categorization. 2. Anticipate the decomposition of a companion's body. To preempt it with burial requires not only sensory knowledge, but temporal projection. Modern neuroscience of mortality salience, the recognition of inevitable death, shows activation in medial prefrontal cortex, areas associated with self-referential thought and social cognition. If Neanderthals engaged in burial, their brains were navigating conceptual spaces where mortality was both feared and ritualized. Some skeletons reveal more than mere placement. The Teshiktash child, discovered with ibex horn cores arranged around the grave, suggests the possibility of grave goods or symbolic offerings. In Shanidar, one adult male survived years with a withered arm and blindness in one eye before being buried after death. His survival reflects care in life, his burial care in death, a continuity of compassion that transcends biological necessity. Emotional intelligence, empathy, and group cohesion are inscribed in such practices. Archaeology here intersects with Psychology. The group not only protected and sustained him, but acknowledged his value beyond utility, embedding him in the shared narrative of the community. Burial also indicates memory anchored to place. Returning to enter a body in a specific cave requires navigational recall, recognition of site significance, and perhaps even shared agreement among group members. The grave becomes a mnemonic marker, binding identity to geography. Cognitive. Anthropologists speak of place memory, where landscape itself becomes an archive of events and meanings. Neanderthal burials, scattered across Eurasia, suggest that caves were not merely shelters, but spaces where memory was sedimented through the act of interment. Skeletal analysis offers additional insights into how death was confronted. Many Neanderthal remains bear traces of injuries healed during life, evidence of survival through communal support. To bury such individuals after death extends the same ethos of care into the symbolic realm. Burial rituals in modern hunter-gatherers often reinforce social bonds by transforming grief into collective meaning. If Neanderthals participated in similar dynamics, their cognition included the capacity to process loss communally, to translate individual mortality into group continuity. The potential use of flowers or other organic offerings, though contested, cannot be dismissed. Even if rodent disturbance accounts for pollen, the broader archaeological record includes pigment traces and possible grave adornments that hint at symbolic layering. Color and ornament in death mirror their use in life, carrying identity across the threshold of mortality. The impulse to decorate a corpse with flowers, pigment, or objects reveals not just recognition of death, but an insistence on meaning in the face of it. Neuroscience of ritual provides a further lens. Studies of repetitive gestures in modern religious practice demonstrate effects on neural circuits regulating anxiety, predictability, and social cohesion. To bury the dead with repeated motions, digging, covering, arranging, could function, similarly, reducing fear and embedding stability in uncertain environments. Ritualized treatment of the dead is not only symbolic, it is regulatory, shaping affective states and aligning group members through synchronized behavior. Yet the fragmentary nature of evidence leaves much unresolved. Only a fraction of Neanderthal remains show signs of burial, raising questions of variability. Did all groups practice interment, or was it restricted to certain regions or individuals? Was burial reserved for particular members, signaling status or kinship, or was it generalized across the population? These uncertainties point toward cultural diversity among Neanderthals, suggesting that symbolic responses to death were not uniform but adapted to local traditions, resources, and circumstances. What persists through these questions is the impression of minds grappling with mortality in structured ways. Each pit carved into cave sediment, each skeleton positioned with care, signifies not mere disposal, but meaning-laden action. Burial bridges biology and abstraction. It transforms flesh into memory, absence into presence, silence into ritual. These gestures hint at inner landscapes where grief was not private, but collective, where mortality itself demanded response, and where the boundary between life and death was negotiated through symbolic behavior. And yet the archaeological record leaves tantalizing silences. If pigment, ornament, or floral offerings were indeed placed with the dead, most have vanished without trace. The caves preserve bones and sediments, but not the emotions that surrounded them, not the words or gestures spoken in darkness, not the beliefs that may have infused these acts. The evidence hangs suspended, enough to compel recognition of ritual, intelligence, but incomplete, leaving the depth of Neanderthal conceptions of death obscured, unresolved, and pressing against the limits of what material traces alone can disclose. Among the most contentious questions in paleoanthropology is whether Neanderthals possessed language comparable to ours. Fossils and genetics suggest that their capacity for communication extended well beyond guttural cries. The evidence, though indirect, accumulates into a picture of a species whose vocal and cognitive systems were equipped for structured speech and whose survival in small, interdependent groups would have demanded precisely such coordination. The discovery of a Neanderthal hyoid bone at Kebara Cave in Israel provides one of the most tangible clues. The hyoid anchors the muscles of the tongue and larynx, and in humans, its position allows the fine modulation necessary for speech. The Kebara hyoid is virtually indistinguishable from that of modern Homo sapiens, a fact that undermines the old notion of limited vocalization. Biomechanical modeling further indicates that the Neanderthal vocal tract could have supported a wide range of sounds. While reconstructions cannot determine exact phonemic repertoires, they make clear that the anatomical preconditions for articulate speech were present. Genetics reinforces this picture. Neanderthals carried the same derived variant of the FOXP2 gene as modern humans, a gene implicated in the neural circuitry underlying speech and language. Mutations of FOXP2 in contemporary populations result in severe impairments in syntax, articulation, and verbal working memory. Its presence in Neanderthal genomes suggests that they shared the neurological substrate for complex vocal communication. Importantly, FOXP2 influences not just motor control of speech, but also the sequencing of actions, an ability crucial in tool-making, hunting, and ritual. The overlap of genetics, anatomy, and behavior forms a triangulation difficult to dismiss. Archaeological context adds further weight. The complexity of Mousterian tools, the coordination required in large game hunting, and the transmission of symbolic practices all imply communication systems beyond simple signals. Coordinated drives of bison or mammoth could not have been managed by pointing alone. They required shared planning, division of roles, and rapid adjustment during execution. Cognitive science distinguishes between proto-language, a system of signs without recursive grammar, and fully fledged language with hierarchical structure. The behaviors inferred from Neanderthal archaeology suggest capacities closer to the latter. Comparative linguistics offers another line of reasoning. All extant human languages, regardless of isolation, share recursive structures and complex grammars. This universality implies deep evolutionary roots, predating the split between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. If our languages derive from a common ancestor population, Neanderthals likely inherited similar capacities. Their divergence was not from absence, but from parallel expression. The neurological demands of language align with brain features inferred from Neanderthal endocasts. Enlarged temporal regions, including areas homologous to Broca's and Wernicke's areas, suggest networks suited for speech production and comprehension. Modern neuroimaging reveals that these regions are not language exclusive, but integrate motor planning, working memory, and social cognition. In Neanderthals, the convergence of tool complexity, group size, and ritual practices points toward a neural architecture in which language could emerge as both necessity and inevitability. Language is more than mechanics of sound. It is also rhythm and prosody. Anthropologists studying traditional oral cultures emphasize how tone, cadence, and repetition enhance memory and social bonding. Around hearths, where shadows flickered and voices carried in confined space, Neanderthal speech may have been embedded in rhythmic patterns that blurred instruction, narration, and ritual. Neuroscientific studies of rhythmic speech show its effects on neural entrainment, aligning listeners' brainwaves with speakers' cadence. Such synchrony fosters collective attention and trust. If Neanderthals employed rhythm in communication, they were not only transmitting information, but also synchronizing minds. The capacity for symbolic thought implied by ornaments and pigments also supports linguistic potential. Symbols in material culture presuppose symbolic capacity in cognition, and language is the most flexible symbolic system. To paint a mark on stone or string a shell is to recognize that objects can signify. To speak is to extend that recognition into sound. The archaeological and cognitive evidence point to overlapping symbolic domains, reinforcing each other across material and auditory channels. Skeptics argue that language leaves no direct fossil, and that absence of extensive symbolic. Art, compared to later Homo sapiens, suggests communicative limitation. Yet preservation bias clouds such comparisons, and linguistic richness does not necessarily correlate with artistic output. Many modern hunter-gatherer societies with minimal material culture possess languages of immense complexity. It is plausible that Neanderthals spoke richly, but the traces of their words dissolved into air tens of thousands of years ago, leaving only indirect echoes in bone and artifact. The social implications of language in Neanderthals extend to empathy and persuasion. To care for injured individuals, to bury the dead, to cooperate in hunts, all require not just action, but negotiation of intention. Speech enables the sharing of plans, the soothing of distress, the reinforcement of loyalty. Neurobiological studies of oxytocin and prosody demonstrate how vocal tone itself modulates trust and emotional states. A Neanderthal voice, resonant in a cave, may have bound companions into coherence as effectively as the hearth that warmed them. Yet the reach of Neanderthal language remains an open question. Did their speech carry the recursive depths of narrative, enabling myth, instruction, and law? Or did it remain anchored in immediate coordination, limited in abstraction, though rich in social nuance? The evidence does not close the gap. It leaves suspended the image of voices that once filled Ice Age valleys, perhaps structured, perhaps lyrical, perhaps as intricate as any spoken today. The silence of prehistory keeps these possibilities unresolved, hanging between probability and imagination, awaiting only further fragments of bone or pigment to tilt the balance of interpretation. Among the most compelling aspects of Neanderthal life is the evidence that survival was not only a product of strength or technology, but of mutual care. Fossils preserve silent narratives of injury, disease, and disability, each one raising questions about how an individual endured conditions that would have been lethal without assistance. The patterns of survival etched into bone point toward a culture in which compassion was not peripheral but central to collective endurance. One of the most striking cases comes from Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan, where the remains of an adult, male, often referred to as Shanidar I, were discovered with severe impairments. He had lost most of his right arm, suffered significant damage to his face, including probable blindness in one eye, and endured crippling injuries to his leg. Yet despite these conditions, his bones show healing, indicating that he lived for years after these traumas. For a hunter reliant on mobility and vision, such injuries would have been catastrophic in isolation. His survival implies sustained assistance, food provision, protection from predators, and social inclusion despite reduced productivity. Other cases repeat this theme. The La Chapelle aux Saints skeleton in France, once misrepresented as brutish by Boulay, revealed advanced arthritis that would have limited mobility. Still, this elderly individual survived into advanced age, suggesting that elders were not discarded but supported. At El Cidrón in Spain, remains show signs of malnutrition and illness endured across months, yet those afflicted persisted long enough for the skeletal traces to form. These examples are not isolated anomalies, but part of a pattern in which vulnerable individuals lived beyond their injuries. From the perspective of evolutionary psychology, such behavior raises profound implications. Natural selection is often framed as competition favoring the fittest individuals. Yet in small social groups, cooperation and care can be adaptive strategies. By supporting injured members, groups retained knowledge, social bonds, and potential contributions outside direct hunting. Cognitive neuroscience underscores how empathy arises from mirror neuron systems in the premotor cortex and inferior parietal regions, enabling individuals to simulate others' pain. If Neanderthals engaged in sustained care, their neural architectures must have integrated empathy into daily life. The archaeological record also provides indirect support for caregiving. At Shanidar, the pollen evidence, regardless of its disputed origin, highlights the interpretive pull toward imagining rituals of compassion. At other sites, healed fractures of ribs, skulls, and long bones reveal the physiological signatures of survival through dependency. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers note that group survival often hinges on protecting vulnerable members, who in return contribute through childcare, storytelling, or transmitting ecological knowledge. Neanderthals, whose survival in harsh climates required memory of migratory patterns and knowledge of raw materials, may have similarly valued non-physical contributions. Caring for the sick or injured also demanded behavioral flexibility. Providing food for a disabled member meant diverting resources from one's own caloric needs. Protection required vigilance and coordination. In evolutionary terms, these behaviors cannot be dismissed as sentimental anomalies. They must have conferred adaptive value. One possibility is that groups with stronger cooperative bonds outcompeted those without, demonstrating how compassion itself could function as survival technology. Neuroscience of pain processing adds another dimension. Studies in modern humans show that observing another's suffering activates neural circuits similar to those engaged by personal pain, a phenomenon sometimes described as empathic resonance. This capacity creates motivational pressure to alleviate distress in others. If Neanderthals shared these neural mechanisms, as suggested by their genetic proximity and fossil evidence of sustained care, then empathy was not an abstract virtue, but a deeply embodied drive shaping behavior. Even the act of tending to wounds or illnesses implies procedural knowledge. Healed fractures suggest immobilization or at least reduction of movement, requiring communal restraint. Malnutrition traces hint at food sharing during scarcity. Some dental calculus samples reveal traces of plants with anti-inflammatory or analgesic properties, raising the possibility that care included medicinal knowledge. To apply such plants intentionally to an ailing companion would require both recognition of their effects and a willingness to invest them in another's survival. The emotional dimension of such care is more elusive but no less critical. Group members who experienced compassion may have reinforced bonds of loyalty, increasing group cohesion and willingness to cooperate in hunts or defense. Social psychology in modern contexts demonstrates that acts of altruism trigger reciprocal trust, stabilizing group dynamics under pressure. In Ice Age environments where survival margins were thin, trust was not optional but essential. Care for the weak may have been a structural pillar of Neanderthal resilience. Yet questions remain unresolved. Was compassion extended universally within groups? Or was it conditional, reserved for kin or high-status individuals? Did care carry symbolic weight, integrating into ritual practices around sickness and death? The fossil record cannot answer definitively, but the repeated survival of impaired individuals implies that care was not rare or exceptional. Its recurrence across regions suggests that compassion was woven into Neanderthal lifeways, a feature of cognition as stable as tool, use, or hunting strategy. The persistence of such evidence forces a reconsideration of what intelligence entails. It suggests that cognition was not limited to problem-solving in the physical environment, but extended into the regulation of emotional life and the creation of networks where vulnerability was integrated rather than discarded. Each healed fracture, each arthritic elder, speaks of minds attuned not only to survival of the strongest, but to endurance of the collective. Yet beneath these traces lies an unresolved question of scope. Whether this compassion expanded beyond immediate groups, or whether the boundaries of care were drawn tightly, excluding outsiders in favor of kin. That tension between inclusion and exclusion remains suspended in the fragments of bone, an unanswered dimension of Neanderthal empathy. The capacity to sustain injured members depended not only on compassion, but on strategies that enabled entire groups to endure conditions of extreme volatility. Neanderthals inhabited landscapes repeatedly reshaped by glacial advance and retreat, environments where winter could last for months, and resources fluctuated with brutal severity. Their persistence across Eurasia testifies to a repertoire of adaptations that reached into physiology, behavior, and culture, forming a resilient response to climates that would have annihilated less flexible species. Paleoclimatic reconstructions using ice cores and pollen analysis show that during the period of Neanderthal occupation, temperatures across Europe often swung sharply within decades, sometimes within a single generation. Glacial pulses transformed open grasslands into tundra, while interglacial phases restored forests and wetlands. Such instability required constant recalibration of subsistence strategies. Stable survival was not possible without acute environmental awareness, recognition of seasonal cycles, migration routes, and resource pulses. Faunal remains illustrate one axis of adaptation. At sites in Central and Eastern Europe, bones of mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, and steppe bison dominate, species capable of yielding immense caloric returns. Yet further west and south, assemblages shift toward ibex, red deer, and smaller prey, demonstrating flexible hunting tailored to local ecosystems. This breadth implies not only opportunism, but an ecological intelligence capable of mapping animal behavior across varied terrains. Stable isotope analysis of Neanderthal bones confirms a diet rich in animal protein, but microfossils embedded in dental calculus add nuance. Traces of cooked legumes, grasses, and even aquatic plants indicate dietary expansion when prey declined. Such diversification reflects more than necessity. It reveals predictive knowledge of ecological niches. Foraging for plant resources in frozen environments requires awareness of locations where edible roots remain accessible beneath snow, or where rivers provide fish and mollusks despite cold. The archaeological record at sites such as Spy Cave in Belgium shows mollusk remains charred by fire, evidence of shoreline foraging and culinary adaptation. These findings point toward cognitive maps of resource distribution, refined across generations and embedded in cultural transmission. Physiology also contributed to survival. Neanderthal skeletons exhibit broad rib cages, short limbs, and robust musculature, traits consistent with thermoregulatory adaptations described by Allen's and Bergman's ecological rules. Such body proportions reduce heat loss, allowing endurance in cold climates. The heavy musculature, evident from attachment sites on bones, reflects not only physical demands of hunting, but also energy storage in the form of higher basal metabolic rates. The very shape of their bodies was an adaptation to the climates they inhabited. An embodied intelligence evolved through millennia of exposure to glacial cycles. Shelter construction further exemplifies adaptive ingenuity. At open-air sites like Moldova in Ukraine, circular arrangements of mammoth bones suggest structures designed to shield against wind and retain heat. Such architecture required not only physical labor, but spatial planning, transforming raw material from hunted animals into protective environments. Caves, when available, were modified with hearths and partitions, turning natural shelters into controlled microclimates. Archaeological layers at Abric Romani indicate repeated occupation across seasonal cycles, suggesting that groups returned intentionally to known refuges, embedding migration into predictable rhythms. Clothing, though rarely preserved, is strongly implied by the archaeological context. Hide scrapers, abundant in Mousterian assemblages, were specialized for softening and thinning skins, processes necessary for creating wearable garments. In sub-zero temperatures, survival without insulation is impossible. Ethnographic parallels with modern hunter-gatherers in Arctic environments highlight the cognitive demands of clothing production. Sewing, binding, and layering require not only technical skill but planning months in advance of winter. Even without direct evidence of needles, the refinement of scrapers indicates systematic preparation of hides, a material culture of protection woven as much from foresight as from sinew. Adaptation extended beyond the physical to the temporal. To survive winter scarcity, groups needed strategies of storage and scheduling. Pits discovered in some sites may have served as storage facilities for meat, cooled by permafrost conditions. Smoke from hearths could preserve flesh, extending caloric value across months. Each act of preservation represents cognition stretched through time, the anticipation of hunger and the preemptive solution embedded in cultural routine. Such practices required not only technical capacity, but social cooperation, for stored resources invite both sharing and conflict. The regulation of access within groups demanded trust, negotiation, and perhaps even proto-normative systems of distribution. The sensory demands of these environments shaped perception itself. Snow alters sound, muffling some cues while amplifying others. Hunting in such conditions required refined auditory awareness. Short winter days forced reliance on low-light vision, an ability supported by the enlarged eye sockets of Neanderthals. These anatomical features, coupled with evidence of enlarged visual cortices, suggest perceptual systems honed for survival in dim, fluctuating conditions. Such adaptations indicate that intelligence was not abstract alone, but deeply embodied, arising from the interplay of brain, body, and environment. Yet adaptation was never without cost. The injuries preserved in bone, the high infant mortality inferred from demographic profiles, and the nutritional stress visible in enamel hypoplasia all revealed the fragility of survival. Each winter imposed a trial. Each climate shift tested the limits of resilience. What allowed Neanderthals to persist for hundreds of thousands of years was not invulnerability, but the constant recalibration of strategies, the fusion of cultural knowledge with embodied endurance. Still, these adaptations prompt unresolved questions. Did their resilience allow them to anticipate climatic transitions beyond generational memory? Were their migrations reactive to immediate shifts, or did they sustain predictive models of change encoded in myth or tradition? The evidence hints at ecological intelligence stretching far beyond instinct, yet the scope of that foresight remains obscured, suspended in the fragmentary record of bones, hearths, and shelters scattered across a continent scarred by ice. The harshness of Ice Age climates pressed Neanderthals into innovation beyond the hunt, drawing their attention to resources less obvious but equally vital. Teeth, with their fossilized calculus, preserve some of the most intimate records of this engagement. Under the microscope, These mineralized plaques reveal fragments of plant fibers, starch grains, and even chemical residues of medicinal compounds. They are minute signatures of knowledge extending beyond nourishment into pharmacology, a hidden archive of ancient experimentation with the botanical world. At El Cedron, in northern Spain, dental calculus from several Neanderthal individuals contained traces of yarrow and chamomile, plants with negligible caloric value but strong medicinal properties. Yarrow carries bitter alkaloids with anti-inflammatory effects. Chamomile contains compounds with mild analgesic and soothing qualities. Their ingestion cannot be explained by subsistence alone. To choose such plants is to recognize their effects on the body, to apply ecological awareness toward regulating pain, infection, or digestion. The presence of these plants in mouths far removed from their flowering season suggests intentional collection and storage, behaviors pointing toward conscious management of herbal resources. Equally telling is the evidence of salicylic acid in Neanderthal dental remains, the active ingredient of modern aspirin. Derived from willow bark, salicylic compounds reduce pain and fever. At El Cedron, one individual with a dental abscess carried chemical traces of this compound, indicating treatment for acute discomfort. Alongside this residue were fragments of Penicillium mold, a natural antibiotic. While chance ingestion cannot be fully excluded, the conjunction of infection and medicinal compounds strongly suggests therapeutic intent. Such evidence implies that Neanderthals were not passive consumers of environment, but active experimenters in the pharmacological properties of plants and fungi. Archaeobotanical studies further extend this view. Charred remains of legumes, nuts, and grasses in hearths reveal systematic selection of edible plants, some of which require detoxification through heat. Bitter acorns, for example, become palatable only after roasting, which neutralizes tannins. The knowledge embedded in such practices reflects cultural accumulation, recognition of toxicity, development of techniques to neutralize it, and transmission of this know-how across generations. This interplay between caution and innovation parallels the logic of medicine itself, where risk and remedy are tightly interwoven. The cognitive demands of such experimentation are profound. Identifying medicinal plants requires observation of correlations between ingestion and physiological response, distinguishing between placebo effects and genuine relief. Cognitive science emphasizes that such causal reasoning involves working memory, pattern recognition, and social transmission. If one member of a group discovered that willow bark eased pain, its efficacy had to be communicated, remembered, and reapplied. This implies not only linguistic capacity, but trust within the group structure. For the act of ingesting unknown substances carries inherent risk. Ethnographic parallels offer perspective. Among modern hunter-gatherers, botanical knowledge often spans hundreds of species, each with nuanced uses for nutrition, ritual, or healing. Such knowledge is rarely random. It is embedded in oral tradition, encoded in story, song, or ritual, ensuring retention across generations. While direct parallels cannot be assumed, the persistence of medicinal traces in Neanderthal remains across regions implies a cultural dimension of transmission. Knowledge of plants was not isolated discovery, but shared inheritance, a pharmacopoeia, cultivated in memory and practice. Neurobiology provides further insight into the mechanisms underlying this engagement. The human brain is acutely sensitive to bitter taste, a sensory adaptation warning against toxins. Yet bitter compounds also carry therapeutic effects. Overriding aversion to bitterness requires cognitive reframing, an association between unpleasant taste and beneficial outcome. This process engages prefrontal circuits mediating reward prediction error, allowing organisms to integrate short-term discomfort with long-term benefit. If Neanderthals consumed bitter yarrow or willow bark intentionally, their cognition had already crossed this threshold, aligning sensation with abstraction and embedding medicinal knowledge into behavioral routine. The boundary between medicine and ritual is difficult to parse. Psychoactive plants, though rarely preserved in the record, may have been part of the same botanical repertoire. Many bitter herbs contain alkaloids with mind-altering effects at certain dosages. In small, carefully administered amounts, they relieve pain. In larger quantities, they induce altered states. Ethnographic accounts of shamans and healers across diverse cultures attest to the ambiguous role of such plants, straddling healing and vision. If Neanderthals experimented with similar substances, their pharmacology may have intersected with symbolic or spiritual domains, blurring survival and transcendence. The ecological intelligence implied by this plant use extends beyond ingestion. Fibers twisted into cords at Abri-du-Maras in France indicate that plants were also manipulated mechanically, their tensile strength harnessed for binding and weaving. This dual application, mechanical and medicinal, suggests a cognitive map of plant properties layered with multiple categories of use. To know a plant was to recognize not only its taste or toxicity, but its texture, strength, and seasonal availability. Each of these attributes was integrated into a broader system of ecological knowledge, one that treated the landscape as pharmacy, workshop, and larder at once. Yet such knowledge was always precarious. Climatic oscillations altered the distribution of plants. Migrations required re-evaluation of new ecologies. The continuity of medicinal practices across regions indicates that Neanderthals maintained adaptive frameworks for rapidly assimilating botanical knowledge in unfamiliar landscapes. But whether these frameworks relied on empirical testing, ritualized experimentation, or both remains an open question. The evidence suggests a capacity for abstraction and cultural inheritance, but its full scope remains suspended in the gaps, between residues on teeth and charred seeds in ash. What endures across these fragments is a vision of minds tuned to subtleties of environment, capable of transforming leaves, bark, and roots into instruments of survival. Yet this vision raises further uncertainties. How extensive was their pharmacopoeia, and how far did it penetrate into symbolic or ritual life? Were these practices localized, or were they part of a broader shared tradition across Eurasian populations? Each chemical trace in dental plaque whispers of deeper systems of knowledge, systems we can glimpse only in fragments, leaving us to wonder at the breadth of healing intelligence now dissolved into the soil. The persistence of Neanderthals in the archaeological record does not end with their skeletal remains. Their presence endures within us, embedded in the very sequences of our DNA. When the Neanderthal genome was first sequenced in 2010, the revelation that non-African modern humans carry between 1% and 4% of their genetic material transformed debates about human uniqueness. The boundary between us and them dissolved into shared inheritance, proving that encounters were not only competitive, but intimate. The genetic evidence is unequivocal. Comparative analysis of modern genomes reveals segments that align closely with Neanderthal sequences, particularly among populations in Europe and Asia. These segments are not scattered at random. They cluster in regions associated with immunity, metabolism, and adaptation to environment. The very structure of our biology today bears the imprint of interbreeding that occurred tens of thousands of years ago in Eurasian landscapes where the two species overlapped. Immunity offers one of the clearest examples. Certain Neanderthal-derived haplotypes within the human genome enhance resistance to pathogens, particularly viruses. Genes associated with the toll-like receptor family, crucial for innate immune response, appear to have entered the modern human gene pool through Neanderthals. Admixture. These sequences heighten sensitivity to microbial threats, a trait likely advantageous when Homo sapiens first migrated into Eurasia and confronted unfamiliar pathogens. What was once the immunological shield of Neanderthals became part of our own defense system. Metabolism carries another legacy. Variants influencing fat storage, lipid metabolism, and glucose regulation trace back to Neanderthal origins. In Ice Age contexts, these genes may have provided critical advantages, allowing efficient energy use in climates where caloric intake fluctuated dramatically. Yet in modern contexts of abundance, some of these variants are associated with increased risk of metabolic disorders such as type 2 diabetes. The genetic inheritance of adaptation, once life-saving, has become double-edged, highlighting the tension between ancient environments and modern lifestyles. Skin and hair also bear Neanderthal signatures, genes influencing keratin production, pigmentation, and hair structure reveal admixture effects, shaping phenotypic diversity across Eurasia. Certain Neanderthal alleles contribute to lighter skin tones, advantageous for vitamin D synthesis in northern latitudes with limited sunlight. Others affect the thickness of skin and hair, potentially adaptations to cold environments. These traits underscore how interbreeding functioned as a form of biological exchange, integrating adaptive solutions developed over millennia into the genomes of Homo sapiens. Yet not all Neanderthal DNA persists. Large portions of their genome are conspicuously absent from modern humans, indicating negative selection against certain variants. Genes associated with male fertility, particularly on the X chromosome, show reduced Neanderthal contribution, suggesting incompatibilities between the species that lowered hybrid reproductive success. Other regions linked to neurological development also appear depleted, raising the possibility that some Neanderthal traits were maladaptive in the context of Homo sapiens' physiology or social structures. The legacy of admixture is not one of seamless blending but of selective retention and rejection, a dynamic interplay between inheritance and adaptation. The psychological implications of interbreeding extend beyond biology. It reframes the relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans from one of strict replacement to one of contact, intimacy, and cultural overlap. Encounters were not limited to competition over resources. They included alliances, exchanges, and kinship. Each surviving allele in modern genomes is a fragment of that history, a molecular echo of relationships across species boundaries. Genetics also complicates the narrative of extinction. If part of Neanderthals survives within us, then their disappearance is less absolute than once imagined. They were absorbed in part through hybridization, their genes continuing while their distinct cultural traditions vanished. This challenges linear notions of evolutionary progress, replacing them with webs of entanglement. Modern humans are not pure descendants of a separate line, but mosaics, carrying traces of multiple hominin species woven into our DNA. Recent studies suggest that Neanderthal inheritance may even influence behavior and cognition today. Associations have been found between Neanderthal-derived variants and traits such as mood regulation, circadian rhythms, and susceptibility to depression. While such correlations remain complex and often tenuous, they suggest that the psychological footprint of interbreeding has not entirely faded. The anxieties, temperaments, or vulnerabilities of modern humans may, in part, be shadows of Neanderthal inheritance expressed in contemporary neural circuits. These revelations expand the concept of intelligence. If traits linked to immunity, metabolism, or cognition were shaped by admixture, then intelligence itself is not an isolated lineage, but a shared construction across species. The blending of genomes produced capacities neither species possessed. Alone, a form of evolutionary synergy encoded not in tools or art, but in the structure of chromosomes. Intelligence, adaptation, and survival were not monopolized by one lineage, but co-authored through interbreeding. Yet this genetic entanglement raises further questions. How extensive was cultural exchange alongside biological admixture? Did interbreeding occur sporadically, in brief encounters, or was it integrated into sustained social interaction? The DNA preserved in our cells provides evidence of contact, but not of context, leaving unanswered whether these unions were acts of alliance, necessity, or coercion. The biological record is clear in its outcomes, but silent in its motivations, a silence that reverberates through every genome sequencing. Result: inviting speculation while withholding resolution. The genetic traces of interbreeding point toward contact, but artifacts extend this narrative into the domain of culture. Archaeological assemblages in regions where Neanderthals and Homo sapiens overlapped reveal evidence of technological and symbolic exchange, suggesting that interaction was not confined to biology. The diffusion of ideas, techniques, and practices between the two species complicates any strict division of cultures, replacing the image of isolation with one of entanglement. In the Châtelperronian culture of southwestern France and northern Spain, toolkits combine Mousterian traditions with elements typically associated with modern humans. Long blades, bone tools, and personal ornaments appear alongside scrapers and points consistent with earlier Neanderthal industries. Radiocarbon. Dating situates these assemblages within a transitional period when Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coexisted in Europe. Debate persists over whether the Châtelperronian represents independent Neanderthal innovation or the adoption of techniques through contact. Either possibility underscores the permeability of cultural boundaries. Neanderthals were either capable of convergent innovation or receptive to external influences, integrating them into their own traditions. Similar patterns emerge in the Ulutian culture of Italy and the Silesian of Central Europe, where assemblages bear hybrid characteristics. The convergence of technologies across species implies not only observation, but active learning. Cognitive anthropologists note that imitation and emulation are powerful vehicles of cultural transmission, requiring not only attention, but the ability to map another's actions onto one's own motor repertoire. If Neanderthals adopted practices from Homo sapiens, or vice versa, it demonstrates cognitive flexibility and social permeability. Personal ornaments provide particularly striking evidence. Beads, perforated animal teeth, and decorated shells appear in sites associated with Neanderthals during these contact periods. The adoption of such items suggests awareness of symbolic codes, perhaps exchanged through trade or intermarriage. Symbolic artifacts cannot be divorced from their social meanings. They function as visible markers of identity, alliance, or belonging. The incorporation of ornaments into Neanderthal assemblages suggests participation in shared symbolic economies, where visual markers transcended species boundaries. Fire technologies and pigment use also exhibit convergence. Red ochre, widely employed by both species, appears in similar contexts across overlapping territories. The parallel use of pigments for decoration or ritual raises the possibility of shared symbolic conventions. While it remains difficult to determine the direction of influence, the synchronicity of practices points toward cultural contact zones where knowledge flowed bidirectionally. These zones may have functioned as crucibles of experimentation, fostering innovations that neither species would have developed in isolation. Social learning underpins these exchanges. Neuroscientific studies of imitation reveal activation in mirror neuron systems and prefrontal circuits responsible for perspective taking. To learn from another species is to recognize intention, to bridge cognitive worlds that were similar, yet distinct. This capacity reflects an advanced theory of mind, the ability to attribute goals and strategies not only to conspecifics, but to others perceived as different. Cultural exchange implies that Neanderthals recognized in Homo sapiens a mind worth imitating and vice versa. The archaeological evidence of blade production techniques further illustrates this permeability. Long, standardized blades characteristic of modern human industries appear sporadically in Neanderthal contexts, requiring a conceptual shift in core preparation. Such techniques demand foresight and precision, reflecting cognitive structures, parallel to language syntax in their hierarchical sequencing. The diffusion of these methods suggests shared demonstrations, prolonged observation, and eventual mastery, processes that demand sustained interaction rather than fleeting contact. The implications of cultural exchange extend beyond tools and ornaments. Shared practices would have required moments of proximity, negotiation, and perhaps even cooperation. Ethnographic parallels show that hunter-gatherer groups often exchange not only goods, but rituals, songs, and stories during encounters. If Neanderthals and Homo sapiens engaged similarly, the flow of knowledge could have included symbolic narratives, ecological information, and strategies for survival. While such intangible exchanges leave no direct fossil record, the material traces hint at deeper layers of interaction now lost to silence. Yet these exchanges also raise questions of asymmetry. Did Neanderthals integrate Homo sapiens innovations more readily than the reverse, or was the flow balanced? Some scholars argue that the abrupt appearance of symbolic artifacts in Neanderthal contexts reflects acculturation under the influence of expanding Homo sapiens populations. Others counter that Neanderthals independently developed symbolic practices, and that similarities merely reflect convergent trajectories. The uncertainty persists because material culture, once blended, resists disentanglement. The tension between innovation and influence reflects a broader truth. Intelligence cannot be confined to species boundaries. When cultures intersect, ideas evolve in unpredictable ways. The Châtelperronian, Ulutzian, and Seletian industries embody this principle, representing not isolated achievements, but dialogues across species. These dialogues complicate narratives of superiority or replacement, revealing instead a mosaic of shared practices that blurred distinctions between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens. The persistence of hybrid cultural assemblages leaves unresolved the scale of exchange. Were these interactions rare, confined to liminal groups at the edges of territories, or were they sustained, integrated into regular cycles of contact? The archaeological record captures snapshots but not frequencies, leaving us with tantalizing glimpses of entangled lives. What remains certain is that the flow of knowledge between species shaped the trajectory of both, embedding traces of Neanderthal thought not only in our genomes, but in the cultural scaffolding of survival. Yet this very permeability carries another layer of consequence. If Neanderthals shared tools, ornaments, and perhaps rituals with Homo sapiens, then the boundary between distinct species identities was not impermeable. Cultural exchange suggests a world where difference was negotiated, where similarity was recognized, and where coexistence was more complex than simple competition. But the balance between cooperation and conflict remains uncertain, suspended in the ambiguity of stone, pigment, and ornament, leaving us to ask how deep these exchanges reached and what tensions they concealed. The traces of exchange between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens do not obscure the stark outcome. One lineage vanished, while the other expanded across the globe. The disappearance of Neanderthals, occurring roughly 40,000 years ago, cannot be attributed to a single cause. Instead, it reflects a convergence of pressures: environmental instability, demographic fragility, and competition that together undermined the resilience that had sustained them for hundreds of millennia. Climate records extracted from Greenland. Ice cores show that Neanderthals endured some of the most volatile swings of the last ice age. Dansgaard-Oeschger events, abrupt warmings followed by sudden returns to glacial cold, transformed habitats in the span of decades. Forests gave way to steppe. Rivers froze and thawed unpredictably. These fluctuations destabilized prey populations, compressing resources, precisely when Neanderthal groups were most vulnerable. Archaeological layers reveal shifts in faunal assemblages that mirror these environmental upheavals. Large herbivores declining, replaced by smaller, less predictable species. Survival demanded rapid adaptation, yet small population sizes amplified the risks of scarcity. Demography was a critical factor. Genetic analyses suggest that Neanderthals lived in small, dispersed groups, often numbering fewer than a few dozen individuals. Effective population sizes reconstructed from DNA indicate long-term bottlenecks, reducing genetic diversity and leaving them susceptible to stochastic collapse. Low genetic variation can compromise immunity, fertility, and adaptability, creating what population geneticists call an extinction vortex, where demographic instability feeds on itself. In this context, even moderate environmental stress could push populations past recovery. Competition with Homo sapiens intensified these pressures. Modern humans entering Eurasia brought technologies that expanded ecological niches, projectile weapons that allowed hunting at a safer distance, tailored clothing that increased mobility across climates, and broader social networks that facilitated information exchange. Archaeological evidence indicates that Homo sapiens organized in larger groups than Neanderthals, with extended trade networks that moved obsidian, shells, and pigments across vast distances. Such networks functioned as insurance against local scarcity, buffering populations against resource fluctuations. Neanderthal groups, more isolated, lacked this level of redundancy. The interaction between the two species was not merely technological, but demographic. Higher reproductive rates among Homo sapiens may have accelerated replacement. Even small differences in fertility can produce significant outcomes over centuries. If Homo sapiens groups expanded more quickly, they would have absorbed territories once occupied by Neanderthals, pushing them into marginal zones. Hybridization softened the edges of this process, but absorption did not prevent overall demographic decline. Pathogens may also have played a role. Contact between previously isolated populations often facilitates disease transmission, as seen in historical encounters between Europeans and indigenous populations of the Americas. If Homo sapiens carried pathogens from Africa to which Neanderthals lacked immunity, outbreaks could have devastated small bands. The genetic evidence that Neanderthal variants bolstered human immunity suggests asymmetrical vulnerability. Humans gained advantages from admixture, while Neanderthals may have faced immunological challenges that compounded existing stresses. Cognitive and cultural differences, though subtler, may have tipped the balance. Homo sapiens appear to have developed more extensive symbolic systems, including art and ritual, which reinforced social cohesion across larger networks. Such symbolic scaffolding enabled alliances beyond immediate kin, allowing cooperation on broader scales. Neanderthals, while capable of symbolism, may not have extended it into expansive coalitions. The ability to imagine shared identity beyond. The local band could have given Homo sapiens a decisive advantage in competition for resources and territory. The archaeological record preserves signs of retreat. In later layers of European caves, Neanderthal occupation becomes patchy, interspersed with increasing evidence of Homo sapiens' presence. Radiocarbon dating suggests overlap lasting several thousand years, a span long enough for interaction but short on evolutionary timescales. The geographic contraction of Neanderthal populations into refugia, pockets in southern Iberia and the Caucasus, marks a species under demographic and ecological siege, yet disappearance was not instantaneous. For millennia, Neanderthals resisted pressures that would eventually overwhelm them, adjusting diets, maintaining traditions, and adapting shelters. Their persistence speaks to resilience as much as their disappearance speaks to vulnerability. What proved insurmountable was not any single challenge, but the convergence of many. Climatic volatility, shrinking numbers, competitive disadvantage, and perhaps the invisible hand of pathogens. The silence of their extinction reverberates through our own history. Each factor, environment, demography, competition, remains plausible, yet none suffices on its own. The collapse of Neanderthal populations was likely uneven, fragmented across regions, with some groups enduring longer than others. This mosaic of decline complicates narratives of inevitability, leaving the process unresolved, suspended between evidence and uncertainty. And within that uncertainty lies a deeper tension. If Neanderthals shared tools, genes, and symbols with us, their disappearance is not merely the loss of another species, but the erasure of a parallel form of human intelligence. Their vanishing forces a confrontation with fragility, the recognition that intelligence alone does not guarantee persistence, that survival depends on forces beyond cognition. The unanswered question is how close the balance was, how narrow the margin between their world and ours, and whether the disappearance of Neanderthals was less a predetermined outcome than a contingent turn in a broader evolutionary story still unfolding. The disappearance of Neanderthals invites not only questions of extinction, but of definition. What does it mean to call a species intelligent, and by what measures do we judge? For more than a century, intelligence was equated with symbolic art, expansive social networks, and rapid innovation, traits highlighted in Homo sapiens while denied to others. Yet the record of Neanderthals undermines this framework, revealing forms of cognition that were different in emphasis but no less profound in scope. Their legacy forces a reconsideration of intelligence as a spectrum of possibilities rather than a singular trajectory culminating in ourselves. One axis of redefinition lies in embodied cognition. Neanderthal intelligence appears deeply rooted in perception and action. Precise stone flaking, mastery of fire, and the coordination of complex hunts. These skills reflect what cognitive scientists describe as procedural and sensorimotor intelligence, where knowledge resides in the seamless integration of body and environment. Modern humans often privilege abstract reasoning, but much of human survival still depends on procedural knowledge: how to drive, how to navigate, how to repair. In this sense, Neanderthals exemplify an intelligence inseparable from physical engagement, an attunement that translated survival into an art of precision. Another axis emerges from their capacity for care and empathy. Intelligence is often framed as problem-solving or innovation, yet the fossil record of Neanderthals demonstrates that compassion was woven into their survival. The willingness to sustain injured or disabled members required foresight, cooperation, and emotional depth. Modern neuroscience places empathy at the center of social cognition, highlighting its role in trust, alliance, and learning. By embedding care within group life, Neanderthals displayed an intelligence that transcended individual adaptation, shaping resilience through collective bonds. This social dimension of cognition challenges definitions of intelligence that reduce it to individual capability. Symbolic thought, too, demands reconsideration. Though their material record of art and ornament is sparse compared to Homo sapiens, the deliberate use of pigments, engravings, and ornaments demonstrates symbolic capacity. The difference may lie not in the presence or absence of symbolism, but in scale and emphasis. Neanderthal symbolism appears localized, embedded in particular acts, decorating shells, marking cave walls, rather than in expansive cultural efflorescence. Yet the ability to invest matter with meaning, however modest, reflects a threshold of abstraction that cannot be denied. Intelligence, viewed through this lens, is not a single crescendo, but a series of parallel experiments in meaning-making. Genetic legacy further complicates definitions. The persistence of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans means that elements of their cognition, immunity, and physiology are part of us. Intelligence, then, is not bounded by species identity, but distributed across interwoven lineages. The human brain today is not solely the product of Homo sapiens evolution, but a mosaic shaped by ancient admixture. To dismiss Neanderthals as failed or lesser is to ignore the ways in which their adaptations remain alive within our bodies, influencing health, perception, and behavior. The philosophical implications are profound. If intelligence can take multiple forms, embodied, empathetic, symbolic, procedural, then our definition of it becomes unstable. Neanderthals demonstrate that cognition need not manifest as monumental art or rapid technological revolutions to qualify as sophisticated. It can manifest in endurance across Ice Age climates, in the maintenance of fire over generations, in the survival of individuals who should have perished without care. Each of these reflects capacities we recognize as hallmarks of intelligence, when observed in ourselves, yet hesitate to grant when found in others. Anthropology confronts here the shadow of anthropocentrism. To measure intelligence only by the yardstick of our own achievements is to risk blindness to other modalities of thought. Neanderthals oblige us to widen our gaze, to acknowledge that intelligence is not a ladder, but a landscape with multiple peaks. Theirs was a mind tuned differently, perhaps less oriented toward vast symbolic networks, but more finely calibrated to perception, cooperation, and ecological nuance. Such variation does not imply inferiority. It reveals the plasticity of cognition itself. Yet this reframing unsettles. If Neanderthals were intelligent in their own right, then extinction was not the removal of a lesser form, but the silencing of an alternative. The loss of their lineage narrows the possibilities of what intelligence could have been, leaving only our own variation to define the category. Their disappearance underscores the fragility of intelligence, the fact that it is no guarantee against disappearance, no armor against the contingencies of climate, disease, or competition. This recognition reverberates into the present. The forces that extinguished Neanderthals, environmental volatility, demographic vulnerability, interspecies competition, remain active threats in our own world, reframed through technology and global scale. If intelligence did not safeguard them, can it safeguard us? The comparison lingers as a warning, not of inevitability, but of vulnerability. Intelligence is powerful, yet precarious, contingent upon conditions that extend beyond neural capacity. The bones, pigments, and genomes of Neanderthals leave us with a paradox. They were close enough to us to share genes, tools, and perhaps stories, yet different enough to embody another trajectory of thought. Their disappearance forces a reckoning not only with the past, but with the meaning of intelligence itself, and that reckoning remains unfinished. For the questions their legacy raises continue to press against the boundaries of our definitions, demanding acknowledgement of minds that thought differently, survived differently, and yet remain inseparably entangled with our own.